The eviction notice was taped to the door when Daniel Foster came home with his 7-year-old son Carter. 3 days' worth of groceries bought on a maxed credit card he'd have no way to pay off. The orange paper glowed in the porch light like a warning fire, official text announcing they had 72 hours to vacate the apartment they'd called home since Carter's mother died 18 months ago in a hospital room that still haunted Daniel's sleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel read the notice twice while Carter waited in the truck, his small face pressed against the window showing the careful blankness children develop when they know something's wrong but don't want to make it worse by asking. The arrears were accurate, 3 months of rent at $800 a month, late fees and legal costs pushing the total to $3,000 Daniel didn't have and couldn't borrow. His construction work had dried up when the economy tanked, unemployment had run out, and the small life insurance policy from Sarah's death had been consumed by medical bills the insurance hadn't covered. He was 34 years old with a 2nd-grade son and 72 hours until homelessness, standing in a New Hampshire October that promised winter wouldn't wait for him to figure things out. The apartment behind that orange notice held everything they owned, Sarah's photographs and Carter's school projects and the accumulated evidence of a life that had been stable until cancer and economic collapse had proven that stability was temporary for people without resources to weather catastrophe. That night, after Carter fell asleep on the couch they'd have to abandon because Daniel had no way to move or store it, he searched foreclosure auctions with the desperate focus of someone who understood he needed a miracle that statistics said wouldn't come. The county was selling tax-delinquent properties the following morning, houses too damaged to be livable, land too remote to be valuable, commercial buildings too obsolete to attract legitimate buyers. The Riverside Mill caught his attention not because it was promising but because the starting bid was $290 and the photographs showed something massive enough to potentially offer shelter even in its decay. Built in 1889 by the Whitmore family, operated until 1981. The textile mill sat on 4 acres along the Merrimack River. The listing noted structural damage, environmental contamination from decades of dye and chemical use, no utilities, and buyer responsible for remediation costs estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Daniel studied the photographs until dawn, a 5-story brick building with most windows broken, loading docks collapsed, the river running past foundation walls that showed water damage and erosion. It was catastrophically damaged, likely unsalvageable, possibly dangerous just to enter. But it had a roof, had space, had walls between Carter and November weather. And $290 was exactly what Daniel had left in a checking account that would be closed by the bank within days. The auction happened in a county office building that smelled like old paper and defeat, attended by 8 people who looked like they were either professional scavengers or as desperate as Daniel. The mill came up third, the auctioneer's voice carrying the bored tone of someone who'd sold hundreds of properties nobody wanted. Riverside Mill, for acres, buyer assumes all liens and environmental obligations. Starting bid $290. Do I hear $290? Daniel raised his hand before he could reconsider, before logic could override the desperate calculation that any shelter was better than none. $290. Do I hear $300? Silence. Nobody else wanted a toxic industrial ruin that would cost a fortune to demolish, let alone remediate. The auctioneer looked around hopefully, found no interest, and brought down his gavel with an air of disappointment that someone had actually bought it. Sold for $290 to bidder 17. Daniel signed papers he barely read, paid with a check that left him with $14 and change, and received a deed to property he hadn't seen in person and had no actual plan for beyond keeping Carter out of the weather. The clerk who processed the sale looked at him with something approaching pity. "You know what you're getting into?" she asked quietly. "The environmental liens alone are over $400,000. You're responsible for remediation before you can sell or develop. Most people who buy these properties end up in bankruptcy." "I know," Daniel said, which was only partially true. He knew it was bad, knew he'd likely made his desperate situation worse, but desperation didn't leave room for thorough research. He picked Carter up from the neighbor who'd agreed to watch him, drove to the mill with dread and hope in equal measure. The property sat at the edge of town where industry had once thrived, surrounded by other abandoned buildings that testified to economic forces that had moved on and left communities to manage the decay. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, its gate hanging open where someone had cut the padlock years ago. The mill loomed against gray November sky, massive and damaged and somehow still standing despite decades of neglect. 5 stories of red brick showing water stains and graffiti, windows that had once held glass now just empty frames, loading docks that had collapsed into rubble. The river ran past 30 feet away, dark water moving with the patient persistence of something that would outlast all human construction. Carter stayed close as they approached, his small hand finding Daniel's with the automatic reflex of a child who'd learned that the world was uncertain. "Is this ours now?" he asked quietly. "Yeah, buddy. This is ours." Daniel tried to make it sound like an achievement rather than a disaster. They entered through a loading dock door that had rotted off its hinges, finding themselves in a ground floor that stretched the length of the building, maybe 300 feet of open space interrupted by support columns and the ruins of textile equipment that had been left when the mill closed. The floor was concrete, cracked but intact, scattered with debris and pigeon droppings and the accumulated trash of trespassers who'd used the space over decades. Water damage showed on walls where the roof had leaked, but sections of ceiling looked solid. It was horrible and huge and technically shelter, which made it better than nothing. Daniel was evaluating whether the upper floors were safe to explore when he heard a vehicle outside. A new Lexus SUV pulled up to the fence, and a man in his 60s climbed out wearing the kind of casual expensive clothes that marked him as someone who'd never worried about rent or eviction. He approached with the confidence of ownership, his expression showing surprise when he saw Daniel and Carter inside. "This is private property," the man said, his tone not quite hostile but close. "You're trespassing. I'm Daniel Foster. I bought this property at auction yesterday. You're the one who's trespassing." Daniel kept his voice level, kept Carter behind him. The man's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "You bought the Riverside Mill. At the county auction." It wasn't a question. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. My family built this mill, operated it for 92 years. I've been waiting for it to come up at auction so I could reclaim it. Then you should have bid. I bought it legally." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Whitmore looked at the mill with an expression that mixed contempt and possessiveness. "Do you have any idea what you've purchased? The environmental contamination alone will bankrupt you. The EPA has this property flagged for Superfund designation. You'll spend years dealing with remediation requirements you can't possibly afford. That's my problem, not yours. It becomes my problem when you inevitably default and the property goes back to auction. I'm prepared to save you that trouble. I'll offer you $5,000 right now, 10 times what you paid, and you walk away without the legal nightmare you've created for yourself." Daniel had done enough construction work to recognize when he was being pressured by people who assumed poverty meant stupidity. Why would you offer $5,000 for a property worth $290 if it was actually worthless? "What's here that you want?" Thomas's friendly demeanor evaporated. "My family's legacy is what's here. This mill represents 4 generations of Whitmores who built something that mattered, that employed this town for nearly a century. It should be in family hands, preserved properly, not owned by someone who bought it as a homeless shelter." The contempt in his voice made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Get off my property. Now." After Whitmore left, Daniel stood in the empty mill feeling the weight of what he'd bought settle into something approaching terror. The man was right about the environmental issues, right that Daniel had no resources to handle contamination or remediation, right that he'd likely made a desperate situation catastrophically worse. But the anger that had flared at Whitmore's condescension stayed with him, stubborn and defiant. He'd been dismissed his entire adult life by people with money who assumed poverty was personal failure, who treated working people like they were temporarily inconvenient obstacles to whatever the wealthy wanted to accomplish. Thomas Whitmore had looked at him and Carter and had seen nothing worth respecting, had offered money like that would solve everything because people like him couldn't imagine problems that money couldn't fix. Daniel spent the rest of the day exploring the mill carefully, checking structural integrity, identifying spaces that might be safely habitable. The ground floor was massive but too exposed. The second floor had collapsed in sections, was clearly dangerous. But the third floor was surprisingly intact, had rooms that had been offices once, had windows that could be boarded, had floors that felt solid. That night, using sleeping bags and camping gear they'd use until eviction, Daniel and Carter stayed in the mill's third-floor office space. It was cold and smelled like mold and pigeon waste, but it had walls and ceiling between them and November weather. Carter fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's changes, while Daniel lay awake trying to make sense of impossible choices. The next morning, he was sweeping debris from what would become their temporary living space when he noticed the floor wasn't quite level in one corner. The boards showed signs of having been deliberately installed differently, sealed rather than just laid. Daniel pried at them with a crowbar he'd found in the wreckage, and the section came up to reveal a hollow space beneath. Inside was a metal case, sealed against moisture, heavy with whatever it contained. Daniel's hands shook as he pulled it out, as he broke the corroded lock and opened it to find documents wrapped in oilcloth. Stock certificates, dated 1981. Corporate bonds from a dozen companies. Treasury notes from the 80s that had matured decades ago. In a handwritten letter in shaky script, "To whoever finds this, I am Henry Whitmore, and I am dying. The mill is closed, my family has abandoned me, and I am too proud to die in poverty when I have resources I spent my life accumulating. I sealed this fortune beneath my office floor because I would rather it be discovered by accident than claimed by a family that called me a failure when the textile industry collapsed. The bonds and certificates here represent 40 years of careful investment, profits from the mill that I saved rather than spent, that my children knew nothing about because I didn't trust them to value anything beyond what they could immediately consume. Total value in today's terms, I estimate between $2 and $3 million if authenticated and properly redeemed. If you found this, you've bought the mill for pennies because my family let it rot rather than preserve it. You've probably been threatened or pressured by Whitmores who want to reclaim property they abandoned but still consider theirs by blood. Don't surrender to them. This fortune is yours by discovery, and you've earned it through having the courage or desperation to actually own what they wouldn't maintain. Use it better than I did. Build something that matters. Don't die alone and bitter like I'm dying, surrounded by wealth but isolated from everyone who should have mattered. The mill was my life's work, and it killed me by consuming everything I had. Learn from my mistake. Henry Whitmore, November 1981. Daniel read the letter 3 times, his mind refusing to process what he'd found. $2 to $3 million in mature bonds and investments, hidden beneath floorboards by a man who'd died alone rather than let his family know what he'd accumulated. It should have been impossible, should have been discovered during foreclosure or demolition preparation, should have been anything except actually real. But the documents looked legitimate, the dates and signatures official, the preservation careful enough to suggest someone who'd planned for discovery rather than permanent concealment. Daniel's hands trembled as he photographed everything, as he carefully repacked the case and hid it again beneath the floorboards. Carter appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Dad? What did you find?" Daniel looked at his son standing in the ruins of a textile mill they'd bought out of desperation, holding documents that might represent salvation or might be worthless paper, and he understood that the next choices would determine whether they survived this or whether poverty and pressure would break them the way it had broken Henry Whitmore. "Something that's going to change things," Daniel said. "But we can't tell anyone until we know exactly what we're dealing with." The mill breathed around them, massive and damaged and holding secrets that had waited 43 years to be discovered, and Daniel committed himself to protecting what he'd found from people who would claim it belonged to them by blood rather than by the accident of desperate purchase and curious investigation. Whatever came next would test whether he had the strength to stand against people with resources and patience, whether he could honor the trust a dying man had placed in whoever was desperate enough to actually own what his family had abandoned. The documents waited beneath his feet, and Daniel Foster prepared for battles he didn't fully understand, armed with nothing except stubborn refusal to surrender what might represent the only chance he and Carter had for the kind of security that poverty had denied them their entire lives. Daniel spent the first week living in the mill like a squatter in his own property, using camping equipment and a portable propane heater, washing at a gas station 2 miles away, keeping Carter's school routine as normal as possible while their actual living situation was anything but. He'd enrolled Carter in the local elementary school using the mill's address, had explained to skeptical administrators that they were renovating the building, had produced the deed as proof of ownership. The documents stayed hidden beneath the third-floor floorboards, photographed and documented but untouched while Daniel researched what he'd actually found. The stock certificates were from companies that had either been acquired or had changed names over 40 years, some worthless, some potentially valuable. The corporate bonds had maturity dates in the 90s, which meant they'd been collecting interest for decades if they were legitimate. The treasury notes alone, if authentic, could be worth hundreds of thousands. But authentication required experts, and experts required money Daniel didn't have. He needed a lawyer who could advise on ownership and a financial analyst who could evaluate the document's current worth. Every consultation would cost hundreds he couldn't pay, and showing the documents to anyone meant revealing what he'd found before he understood his legal position. The decision was made for him when Thomas Whitmore returned, this time with his son Robert and a lawyer named Patricia Chen who carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who'd spent a career winning disputes. They arrived in 2 vehicles, blocked the mill's entrance, and waited for Daniel to emerge from the 3rd floor where he'd been boarding windows against the coming winter. "Mr. Foster," Patricia began, her tone professionally cordial, "I represent the Whitmore family's interests regarding this property. We're prepared to make you a more substantial offer than Mr. Whitmore's initial proposal. $20,000 for immediate transfer of the deed, with you released from all environmental liability and remediation obligations." $20,000 was more money than Daniel had seen at once in his life, was enough to rent an apartment and provide stability for Carter while Daniel looked for work. It was a reasonable offer if the mill was actually worthless, if the documents he'd found were fraudulent or if the environmental costs would consume any value the property might hold. But Thomas Whitmore's expression, eager and impatient, told Daniel the offer wasn't generous, it was desperate. "Why do you want this property so badly?" Daniel asked. "Your family abandoned it 40 years ago, let it fall into ruin, didn't pay taxes for a decade. What changed?" Robert Whitmore spoke for the first time, his voice carrying his father's condescension. "Our grandfather Henry Whitmore died in this building in 1981. We have reason to believe he left personal property here that belongs to the family estate, that should have been discovered during probate but wasn't. Whatever you've found in your exploration of the property needs to be turned over to us." So they knew. Somehow the Whitmores knew Henry had hidden something, had been waiting for the mill to come to auction so they could buy it cheaply and search at their leisure. Daniel's purchase had disrupted plans that had been decades in the making. "I haven't found anything that belongs to you," Daniel said carefully. "The mill and everything in it became my property when I bought it at auction. That's how foreclosure sales work." Patricia's professional courtesy flickered. "Mr. Foster, if you've discovered documents or property that belonged to Henry Whitmore, concealing them could constitute theft. The estate was never fully settled. Henry's children believed he'd died in poverty, but recent evidence suggests he may have had assets that were deliberately hidden. Those assets would belong to his heirs, not to whoever purchased the building decades later." "What evidence?" "That's not something we're obligated to share with you. But I'll be direct, if you've found financial instruments or documents of value, the legal battle over ownership will be expensive and prolonged. The Whitmore family has resources to sustain years of litigation. You don't. Taking our offer would avoid complications that will almost certainly bankrupt you." The threat was barely veiled, the strategy identical to what Daniel had seen his entire working life. People with money and lawyers using the cost of fighting as weapon to force settlements that heavily favored them. They'd make defending his rights so expensive that surrender would look reasonable, would tie him up in legal processes designed to drain whatever resources he managed to scrape together. "I'll consider your offer," Daniel said, which was a lie but bought him time. After they left, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He called the one lawyer he knew, a legal aid attorney named Marcus Webb, who'd helped him navigate Sarah's medical bankruptcy. Marcus worked for people who couldn't afford representation, who needed advocates willing to fight despite knowing payment would be minimal or non-existent. They met at a diner near the mill, Daniel spreading photographs of the documents across a corner booth while Marcus studied them with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "These are legitimate," Marcus said after 20 minutes of examination. "The stock certificates can be authenticated through transfer agents, the bonds through their issuers, the Treasury notes through the Federal Reserve. If they're real and properly documented as Henry Whitmore's property, they're worth substantial money." "How much?" "Conservatively, $1.5 million, maybe $2 million after authentication and redemption. Some of these companies were acquired at premiums, some of these bonds have been accruing interest for 40 years. Marcus looked up from the photographs. "But Daniel, ownership is going to be legally complex. The Whitmores will argue these assets belong to Henry's estate, that they should have been distributed to his heirs when he died. But he hid them deliberately. His letter says he wanted whoever found them to keep them, that he didn't trust his family. A letter isn't a legal will, and even if it was, estates have requirements about creditor notification and heir distribution. The Whitmores have a legitimate claim that these assets should have been part of probate." Marcus paused. "However, you also have a legitimate claim. You bought the property legally, everything in it became yours through that purchase, and Henry's letter constitutes evidence of his intent that these assets go to whoever found them rather than to his family. So what happens? They'll sue. They'll argue the estate was improperly settled, that these assets need to be recovered and distributed to rightful heirs. You'll argue that 43 years of abandonment and failure to maintain the property constitutes forfeiture of any claim to items discovered within it. It'll be expensive, it'll take months or years, and the outcome isn't certain." Daniel felt familiar despair settling in. "I can't afford to fight them. I can barely afford to feed Carter. I know. Which is why I'm going to take this case pro bono, because the Whitmores using their resources to pressure someone who bought property legally makes me angry." Marcus's expression showed he meant it. "I can't guarantee we'll win, but I can guarantee they won't win through intimidation alone." The lawsuit was filed within a week, Whitmore Family Trust versus Daniel Foster, seeking recovery of estate assets and claiming Daniel had been unjustly enriched through discovery of property that should have been distributed to heirs. The filing was accompanied by an emergency motion to secure the documents, arguing they might be destroyed or hidden if left in Daniel's possession. Marcus countered with his own filing documenting Daniel's legal purchase of the property and everything within it, presenting Henry's letter as evidence that the deceased had intended these assets for whoever found them rather than for family he'd explicitly distrusted. He requested the court appoint a neutral third party to authenticate and secure the documents while ownership was litigated. The judge agreed, ordering all disputed documents turned over to a court-appointed trustee who would verify their authenticity and value while the legal battle proceeded. Daniel spent an afternoon carefully extracting the hidden case from beneath the floorboards, photographing its location and condition, documenting everything before surrendering it to officials who would determine whether he'd found salvation or just another form of trouble. That night, in the cold third-floor space that had become home, Carter asked the question Daniel had been dreading. "Are we going to have to leave? Like we left the apartment?" Daniel looked at his son, at the 7-year-old who'd lost his mother and stability within 18 months, who'd adapted to living in an abandoned mill without complaint, who deserved better than the uncertainty Daniel kept providing. "I don't know, buddy. But I'm fighting to keep us here, to make this place actually ours. The people who used to own the mill want to take it back, want to take the valuable things I found. We have to prove that what I bought legally belongs to me legally, even when people with more money say it doesn't. Will we win? I hope so. But sometimes good people lose to people with better lawyers and more patience, and we have to be prepared for that." Carter absorbed this with the seriousness children develop when adult problems become their problems too. "Mom would want us to fight. She fought the cancer even when doctors said she couldn't win." The observation hit Daniel hard, brought tears he'd been holding back since Sarah's death. She had fought, had endured treatments that were worse than the disease, had survived 9 months longer than prognosis suggested because she'd refused to surrender to statistics. She'd died anyway, because some battles couldn't be won through willpower alone, but she'd taught Carter lessons about courage that Daniel was still learning to apply. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She'd want us to fight." Over the following weeks, Daniel discovered that the Whitmore family's pressure extended beyond legal filings. The town's building inspector appeared without warning, citing numerous code violations that would require expensive remediation before the mill could be occupied. The Environmental Protection Agency sent notice that soil and water testing was required before any construction or renovation could proceed, that contamination from 40 years of textile operations created liability Daniel would need to address. Each notice, each inspection, each requirement added costs that Daniel couldn't meet. The strategy was transparent: make ownership so expensive and complicated that selling to the Whitmores would look like relief rather than surrender. And it was working, because Daniel had no resources to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. But something unexpected happened as the fight became public. The local newspaper ran a story about the dispute, framing it as wealthy family attempting to reclaim property they'd abandoned, pressuring new owner who'd bought it legally at auction. The article mentioned Henry Whitmore's hidden fortune and his letter expressing distrust of family who'd called him a failure when the textile industry collapsed. The response revealed complicated community feelings about the Whitmores. The family had employed hundreds during the mill's operation, had been pillars of the community for generations, had donated to schools and hospitals and civic organizations. But they'd also closed the mill abruptly when textiles moved overseas, had provided minimal severance to workers who'd spent careers there, had abandoned the building to decay rather than maintaining it or selling it to buyers who might preserve it. Former mill workers contacted Daniel with stories about Henry Whitmore, a difficult man who'd been devoted to quality textile production, who'd paid fair wages when competitors cut corners, who'd stayed in business years longer than economics justified because he couldn't bear to close something he'd dedicated his life to building. Margaret Chen, who'd worked as Henry's bookkeeper for 30 years, visited the mill one afternoon with documents she thought Daniel should see. She was 78, moved carefully, spoke with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime keeping accurate records. Henry knew his family considered him a failure, Margaret said, settling into a folding chair Daniel had set up in the third-floor office. His children wanted him to sell the mill in the 70s when land values were high, invest the money, retire comfortably. He refused because the mill was his identity, because closing it meant admitting the industry he'd devoted his life to was dead. When did he hide the fortune? The week before he died. He'd liquidated investments over several months, converted everything to bonds and certificates that could be physically secured. He told me he was protecting assets from creditors, but I think he was protecting them from family who'd inherit but wouldn't value what he'd built. Margaret pulled documents from her bag. These are copies of his personal correspondence from 1981. He wrote to his children explaining why he was hiding resources, telling them they'd proven through their pressure to close the mill that they measured worth through money rather than legacy. Daniel read letters that showed a bitter old man who'd outlived his industry, who'd watched children he'd raised become strangers who valued property over principles, who'd chosen to die alone rather than surrender to family expectations he couldn't respect. One letter to his son Thomas was particularly revealing: "You've spent 5 years pressuring me to sell, to take the money and retire, to admit that textiles are finished and holding on to the mill is stubborn pride. But this mill represents my life's work, represents employment I provided and quality I maintained when competitors chose profit over craft. Closing it because maintaining standards isn't profitable anymore would be admitting that principles matter less than comfort, and I won't teach that lesson. I'm dying, Thomas. The doctors give me months. When I'm gone, you'll inherit the mill and you'll sell it immediately for whatever you can get. You'll take the money and forget that this building represents 4 generations of Whitmores who built something that mattered. So I'm taking steps to ensure you inherit the building but not the resources I spent my life accumulating. Those resources will go to whoever values this property enough to actually own it rather than just liquidate it. You'll call this spite. I call it teaching you the lesson you refuse to learn, that inheritance is burden as much as benefit, that receiving something of value carries obligation to honor what made it valuable. The mill will rot or it will be reborn. Either way, you won't profit from my death the way you've been waiting to profit. The letter was dated October 1981. Henry had died in November, alone in the mill's office, his family learning of his death only when a creditor tried to contact him and found the building locked with his body inside. Daniel understood more fully what he'd inherited, not just a building and hidden documents but the complicated legacy of a man who'd chosen principles over family, who'd died alone rather than compromise, who'd hidden wealth as final act of defiance against children he believed had failed him. The authentication process took 3 months. The court-appointed trustee worked with transfer agents and bond issuers, verified signatures and dates, tracked ownership through corporate mergers and name changes. The final report valued the documents at $1.8 million after redemption, with Daniel and the Whitmore estate both claiming ownership pending litigation. The Whitmores immediately escalated their pressure. Robert Whitmore filed complaints with Child Services suggesting Carter was being raised in unsafe conditions, that Daniel's decision to live in a contaminated industrial building constituted neglect. Social workers visited, documented the situation, filed reports that were concerning but not quite actionable. Daniel was providing food and shelter and education, even if that shelter was unconventional. But the scrutiny was deliberate harassment designed to make Daniel's life so complicated that surrendering would seem reasonable. And it was working, because fighting on multiple fronts, legal ownership, environmental compliance, building codes, child welfare investigations, required resources and energy Daniel couldn't sustain indefinitely. Marcus filed motions documenting the harassment, arguing the Whitmores were using their resources to create pressure unrelated to their legal claim. The judge issued warnings but no sanctions, noting that building code enforcement and child welfare concerns were technically separate from the ownership dispute even if the timing was suspicious. On a cold February evening, 6 months after buying the mill, Daniel received an unexpected visit. Thomas Whitmore arrived alone, without lawyers or his son, looking older and tired in ways that suggested the fight was costing him too. "Can we talk?" Thomas asked. "Just the two of us, no attorneys, no posturing. I think we both need to understand what we're actually fighting for." They sat in the third-floor office where Henry Whitmore had hidden his fortune and died alone, two men separated by class and resources but connected by a dead man's complicated legacy. "My father was a hard man," Thomas said. "Demanding, critical, measuring worth through work and standards that were often impossible to meet. He built a successful mill, employed this town for decades, maintained quality when competitors took shortcuts. But he also pushed away everyone who loved him, made relationships conditional on meeting expectations nobody could sustain. That's why he hid the money. Because he didn't trust you to value what he'd built." "Yes. And he was right not to trust us. We did sell the mill immediately after his death, we did take whatever money we could get and move on. But we were also exhausted from decades of trying to please a man who was never satisfied, who measured our worth through whether we shared his obsession with a dying industry." Thomas paused. "I'm 73 years old. My son Robert is carrying on this fight because he thinks family legacy matters, but I'm tired of battles that started before I was born." "Then why are you here?" "Because watching you fight for property you bought legally has made me reckon with what my father was trying to teach us through hiding that fortune. He wanted whoever found it to value the mill enough to defend it, to prove through fighting that they understood inheritance carried obligations beyond just receiving. You've proven that. You're living in squalor with your son, spending money you don't have on legal fees, refusing to surrender even when surrender would be easier." Thomas pulled an envelope from his coat. "This is a settlement offer, but not the kind my lawyers proposed. I'm withdrawing the family's claim to the hidden assets. The $1.8 million is yours legally and ethically, you found it, you've earned it through defending property my family abandoned. In exchange, I'm asking that you use some portion of that money to preserve the mill itself, to restore it in ways that honor what my father built here." Daniel read the document carefully, not quite believing what he was seeing. "You're just giving up?" After 6 months of pressure and lawsuits and harassment, I'm accepting what my father tried to teach us, that legacy matters more than money, that some things are worth preserving even when preserving them isn't profitable, that inheritance comes with obligations to honor what previous generations built. Thomas stood, moved to the window overlooking the river. My father died bitter and alone because he chose principles over people, because he couldn't balance what he'd built with the relationships that should have mattered more. I don't want to die the same way, fighting battles that serve ego rather than purpose. After Thomas left, Daniel sat alone in the office where everything had changed, holding a settlement document that represented more than legal resolution. It represented recognition that he'd stood for something that mattered, that refusing to surrender had proven him worthy of what he'd found. The $1.8 million would provide security for Carter, would allow restoration of the mill, would transform desperate purchase into foundation for whatever future he chose to build. But it also carried weight beyond money, obligation to honor Henry Whitmore's trust by actually valuing what the old man had died protecting, by proving that sometimes desperate people who bought property nobody wanted could build something worthy of the inheritance they stumbled into through accident and courage. The mill breathed around him, massive and damaged but no longer abandoned, holding secrets that had waited 43 years to be discovered by someone desperate enough to see possibility in ruins. Daniel had bought shelter and found fortune, had fought battles he couldn't afford because surrendering would have taught Carter the wrong lessons about what standing for things actually required. Now he faced different challenges, not fighting to keep what he'd found but honoring the trust that came with keeping it. Not surviving desperation but building something meaningful from the opportunity desperation had led him to. The documents were his, the money was coming, and the burden of using both wisely would define whether he became another cautionary tale about found fortune squandered or proof that sometimes the land gave back what it had taken to those stubborn enough to stand their ground. The authentication and redemption process took another 4 months. Bureaucratic machinery grinding through decades-old certificates and bonds with the slow precision of systems designed to prevent fraud. Marcus guided Daniel through each step, proving Henry Whitmore's ownership, establishing the chain of custody from hidden floor compartment to court trustee, documenting that Daniel's legal purchase of the mill included everything within it. The financial firms that issued the original bonds were mostly absorbed by larger institutions, requiring layers of verification and corporate archaeology to trace ownership through mergers and acquisitions. But the documents were legitimate, the signatures authentic, the decades of accrued interest calculated with mathematical certainty. When the final redemption check arrived, $1,743,000 after legal fees and processing costs, Daniel stared at numbers that seemed impossible for someone who'd been 3 days from homelessness 8 months earlier. He deposited half immediately into accounts for Carter's future, college funds and trusts that would provide security regardless of what happened with the mill. The discipline came from watching Sarah's medical bills consume their savings, from understanding that stability was built through protecting against catastrophe rather than assuming catastrophe wouldn't come. The remaining money went toward the mill's transformation, but not the kind of restoration Thomas Whitmore had probably imagined. Daniel hired environmental consultants who assessed the contamination honestly, dye residues in soil, chemical traces in groundwater, asbestos in older sections of the building. The remediation cost $300,000, consumed 6 months of work, left the property clean to standards that would allow human occupancy and eventual development. But Daniel wasn't developing the mill into condominiums or commercial space that would maximize profit. He was creating something that honored both Henry Whitmore's trust and the building's history while serving present community needs. The ground floor became a maker space and workshop facility, providing equipment and space for craftspeople who couldn't afford commercial rent. Woodworkers and metalworkers and artists who were being priced out of gentrifying areas found affordable workspace in a building that had once produced textiles and now produced different forms of craft. The second floor, after structural reinforcement, became affordable artist studios with northern light and river views. Daniel kept the third floor as living space for himself and Carter, but he hired contractors to do the work properly: insulation and heating, functional plumbing and electricity, windows that actually sealed against New Hampshire winters. The office where Henry had hidden his fortune was preserved as it had been, a small museum space documenting the building's history and the complicated man who'd died protecting it. The restoration took 18 months and cost $700,000, leaving Daniel with substantial reserves but not unlimited resources. He'd built carefully, had listened to architects and engineers who understood how to honor historical buildings while making them functional. The mill that emerged was different from what it had been, cleaner and safer and purposeful, but it still carried the weight of its industrial past in exposed brick and massive timber beams and the patient flow of the river outside. Carter thrived in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. Living in the mill meant living in a community of artists and craftspeople who treated an 8-year-old as someone worth teaching rather than tolerating. He learned woodworking from a furniture maker who rented ground floor space, learned metalwork from a sculptor who needed Carter's small hands to reach into tight spaces, learned that work and creativity weren't separate things but different expressions of the same impulse to build. The transformation wasn't just physical. Carter had been quiet and withdrawn after Sarah's death, had carried grief in ways that made Daniel ache because he didn't know how to lighten that burden. But surrounded by people making things, contributing to projects that resulted in tangible accomplishments, Carter began to open up. He talked about his mother more freely, shared memories without the crushing sadness that had defined the first year after her death. One evening, working with the furniture maker on a small table Carter was building for his room, Daniel's son asked a question that showed how much he'd been thinking about their situation. Did we deserve to find the money? Or were we just lucky? The furniture maker, a woman named Rebecca who'd been displaced from Boston by rising rents, paused her own work to listen, understanding this was the kind of question that mattered. I think we earned the right to keep it, Daniel said carefully. Not by deserving it more than other people, but by standing ground when people with more power tried to take it. Henry Whitmore hid that fortune for whoever was brave enough or desperate enough to actually own the mill, and we proved we were both. But we were going to be homeless. That's why you bought the mill, not because you wanted to preserve it. That's true. Desperation brought us here, not noble purpose. But what we did after finding the money, fighting to keep it, using it to restore the building, creating spaces for other people who needed them, that transformed lucky accident into something earned. Carter absorbed this, his hands continuing to sand the table he was building. Great-grandpa died alone because he chose the mill over his family. Are you choosing it over me? The question hit Daniel like physical impact, forced him to confront fears he'd been suppressing. No, buddy. The mill is a tool, a way to provide for us and create something meaningful. But if I ever have to choose between this place and you, I choose you. Every time. Mom would be proud of what we're doing, Carter said quietly. She liked when you helped people, when you built things. She'd like that we're not just keeping the money but using it. Rebecca spoke for the first time since Carter's question. Your dad's building community in a building that used to isolate its owner. That's the difference between inheriting and learning. He inherited the mill and the money, but he learned not to make Henry Whitmore's mistakes about choosing property over people. The observation stayed with Daniel long after Carter went to bed. He was conscious of the balance he was trying to maintain, honoring Henry's trust while not becoming Henry, building something meaningful while not sacrificing the relationships that actually mattered. It was harder than simple accumulation or simple sacrifice, required constant evaluation of whether choices served purposes beyond ego or comfort. Thomas Whitmore visited twice over the following year, both times without lawyers or agenda beyond seeing what Daniel had built. The first visit was stiff and formal, Thomas walking through spaces his grandfather had operated, seeing textile equipment replaced by woodworking tools and welding stations, absorbing transformation that honored history while serving different purposes. This isn't what I expected, Thomas said, standing in the ground floor workshop watching a furniture maker demonstrate joinery techniques to 3 apprentices. I thought you'd convert it to condos, maximize profit. That would dishonor what Henry trusted me to do. He didn't hide the money so I could get rich, he hid it so someone who actually valued the building would have resources to preserve it properly. Daniel paused. You withdrew your claim because you recognized I'd proven worthy of what I found. Converting the mill to luxury housing would prove you wrong. The second visit, 6 months later, was easier. Thomas brought his granddaughter Emma, a teenager interested in textile history, and Daniel gave them a tour that included the preserved office and exhibits documenting the mill's operation. Emma asked sharp questions about production methods and worker conditions and why the textile industry had collapsed, the kind of engagement that showed she understood her family's legacy was complicated rather than simply proud. "My great-great-grandfather died angry at us," Emma said, reading Henry's letter that was displayed under glass. "He thought we didn't value what he'd built." "He was angry at what he'd built consuming his life," Daniel corrected gently. "He loved this mill, but it also isolated him from family. He wanted whoever found his hidden fortune to learn from that mistake, to value the building without letting it become more important than people." After they left, Daniel found Thomas had left an envelope containing photographs from the mill's operation, workers at looms, finished textiles stacked for shipping, Henry Whitmore standing in the same ground floor space that was now a workshop, his expression showing pride and exhaustion in equal measure. A note was attached, "For the museum. So people remember what this building was before understanding what it became." The gesture felt like reconciliation, like Thomas accepting that transformation honored legacy better than preservation of ruins would have. The Whitmore family had built the mill, had operated it for nearly a century, had employed generations of workers. But they'd also abandoned it when economics made operation unprofitable, had let it decay rather than finding new purposes for it. Daniel had stumbled into ownership through desperation but had chosen to honor the building's history while adapting it to serve present needs. Margaret Chin became the mill's unofficial historian, donating hours to organizing exhibits and interviewing former workers about their experiences. She was 79 now, moved more slowly than when Daniel first met her, but her mind remained sharp and her memory of Henry Whitmore added depth to the museum's documentation. "Henry was trapped by the mill," Margaret said one afternoon while they organized photographs. "He'd inherited it from his father who'd inherited it from his father, and closing it felt like admitting 3 generations had wasted their lives. So he kept operating long past the point where it made economic sense, alienated his children who saw clearly what he couldn't accept, that industries die regardless of individual dedication. But he also maintained standards when competitors didn't. The workers I've interviewed said he paid fairly, provided safe conditions, cared about quality. Yes, and that's the tragedy, he was a good man running a good operation in an industry that was dying. His children weren't wrong to pressure him to sell and retire. He wasn't wrong to believe closing the mill meant admitting defeat. They were both right and both wrong, and nobody could bridge the gap between those positions." Daniel thought about this often as the mill found its rhythm as a maker space and affordable studio facility. He was building something different from what Henry had built, but he was applying similar principles: maintain quality, treat people fairly, measure success through what you create rather than just what you accumulate. The difference was understanding that buildings served people rather than people serving buildings, that legacy was built through adapting rather than stubbornly preserving what economics had rendered obsolete. The financial sustainability surprised him. Charging below market rent for workshop and studio space meant the mill wouldn't make him wealthy, but it covered operating costs and provided modest income. More importantly, it created community in a building that had been designed for industrial isolation. Artists and craftspeople who'd been working alone in scattered locations now had colleagues and collaborators, could share equipment and knowledge in the simple comfort of not being solitary in their work. Daniel had expected to be landlord, had prepared for the transactional relationships property ownership usually created. But the mill's tenants treated him as fellow maker rather than owner, included him in their projects and teaching, shared their knowledge in ways that revealed how much community had been missing from his own working life. He learned metalwork from the sculptor who'd taught Carter, learned furniture joinery from Rebecca who'd become a friend and occasionally more than friend, learned that work could be collaborative rather than just individual effort towards separate goals. The mill had saved him from homelessness, but the community it housed saved him from isolation he hadn't fully recognized until its absence showed him what he'd been missing. On a warm evening in June, 3 years after buying the mill for $290, Daniel and Carter stood on the third-floor balcony watching the river flow past stone foundation walls. The building behind them was alive with activity, workshops humming with late-evening projects, studio lights showing artists working past normal hours, the sound of conversation and creation that made the mill feel inhabited rather than just occupied. Carter was 10 now, taller and confident in ways that showed he'd moved past grief into acceptance that his mother's death was tragedy but not the end of everything. He'd built a small business selling cutting boards and boxes he made in the workshop, had regular customers who appreciated his careful craftsmanship, had learned that work well done created its own satisfaction beyond money. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" Carter asked, the kind of question that showed he was thinking about futures that extended beyond immediate circumstances. "I don't know about forever, but I think we'll be here a long time. This place gave us more than shelter, it gave us purpose, gave us community, taught us that sometimes desperate gambles lead to better outcomes than careful planning." Daniel paused. "But if staying ever stops serving you, if you need to leave to become who you're meant to be, then we'll figure that out when it happens. I like it here. I like building things with people who care about doing them right. I like that we helped make a place where other people can do that too." The simple clarity of his son's perspective made Daniel recognize how far they'd come from the desperate father and grieving child who'd bought an abandoned mill because it was $290 and had walls. They'd found fortune and fought to keep it and used it to build something that served purposes beyond their own security. That transformation, from survival to purpose, was Henry Whitmore's real legacy, the lesson he'd tried to teach through hiding wealth for whoever proved worthy of finding it. Rebecca joined them on the balcony, carrying 3 glasses and a bottle of cider she'd made from apples harvested behind the mill. She'd been living in one of the second-floor studios for 2 years, had built a successful furniture business and an easier relationship with Daniel than either of them had been looking for but both appreciated. "The looms arrived," she said, settling against the railing. The Textile Museum in Lowell donated 3 industrial looms from the same era as when this mill operated. Margaret's organizing an exhibit showing how they worked, maybe teaching weaving classes. Daniel had resisted putting working looms in the building, had worried it would be too literal a recreation of what the mill had been. But Margaret had convinced him that honoring history meant showing people what actual textile production looked like, not just preserving empty spaces. Henry would probably appreciate that, Daniel said. His children wanted him to abandon textiles entirely, move into completely different industries. But there's value in remembering what was built here, in teaching people skills that were once common and now are nearly lost. They stood together watching evening settle over the river, 3 people who'd been brought together by the mill's transformation from ruin to community space. Daniel thought about the journey that had led here, from eviction notice to desperate auction bid, from hidden fortune to legal battle, from simple ownership to the complicated responsibility of building something meaningful. He'd learned what Henry Whitmore had tried to teach through his bitter final letter, that inheritance came with obligations extending beyond simple possession, that found wealth mattered most through what you built with it, that the measure of success wasn't accumulation but what you created that served purposes larger than yourself. The mill would outlast him, would continue housing artists and craftspeople long after Daniel was gone, would stand as proof that sometimes desperate people making impossible gambles stumbled into opportunities that transformed both them and the communities they served. Henry had hidden his fortune believing his family didn't deserve it, had died alone because he'd chosen property over people. Daniel had found that fortune and had used it to prove that buildings could serve community rather than isolate owners. That legacy was built through adapting rather than simply preserving. As darkness completed its claim on the day and lights came on throughout the mill showing the life and work happening within it, Daniel felt the weight of 3 years settle into something approaching peace. Not perfect resolution, because life didn't offer those, but acceptance that he'd honored the trust placed in him by a bitter old man he'd never met, that he'd transformed desperate purchase into foundation for community, that he'd taught Carter lessons about using resources wisely and standing for principles even when standing was expensive. The river flowed past stone walls that had supported the building for over a century, patient and persistent, witnessing the slow work of mills being built and abandoned and rebuilt for different purposes. Henry Whitmore had poured his life into textile production, had died protecting wealth he'd accumulated through that work. Daniel had found that wealth and had poured it back into the building, had created something that honored Henry's dedication while learning from his isolation. That was enough. More than enough. It was inheritance transformed through understanding, desperation converted into purpose, proof that sometimes the places we stumble into through accident become exactly where we needed to be if we're brave enough to see possibility in ruins and stubborn enough to build what others had abandoned. The mill breathed in the evening air, no longer abandoned or isolated but alive with the work of dozens of people who'd found affordable space to practice their crafts, and Daniel knew he'd accomplished what Henry's letter had challenged him to do, used the fortune better than Henry had, built community where Henry had built walls, created legacy through sharing rather than hoarding. The building stood as monument to that choice, to the idea that inheritance carried obligations, that found wealth mattered through what you built rather than what you simply kept. 15 years passed like water flowing past the mill's foundation, each season leaving its mark on brick and timber the way experience marks people who pay attention to what time teaches. Daniel watched Carter grow from the 10-year-old who'd built cutting boards in the workshop to a 25-year-old man preparing to launch his own sustainable furniture company, his designs combining traditional joinery with modern efficiency in ways that honored both craft and practicality. The mill had evolved with them. What began as maker space and affordable studios had grown into something more comprehensive, a community resource that provided not just workspace but training programs, apprenticeships for young people learning trades, small business incubation for craftspeople transitioning from hobby to livelihood. The financial model remained deliberately modest, charging enough to sustain operations but not enough to maximize profit, proving that buildings could serve community purposes without requiring wealthy benefactors or constant fundraising. Daniel was 49 now, his hair showing gray, his hands bearing scars from 15 years of working alongside the tenants he'd once thought of as simply renters. He'd learned welding and woodworking and textile arts from people who'd taught him that making things with your hands created different kinds of satisfaction than managing property or accumulating wealth. The mill had given him purpose beyond providing for Carter, had revealed that community was built through shared work rather than simply shared space. Rebecca had become his partner in ways that went beyond their initial cautious relationship, though they'd never married or combined households in traditional ways. She maintained her studio on the second floor, he kept the third-floor apartment, and they built a life together that respected both connection and independence. Carter had grown up with her as consistent presence rather than replacement mother, had learned from her example that families could be chosen and constructed rather than just inherited through blood. Margaret Chin had passed away 3 years earlier at 86, her final months spent organizing the mill's historical archives with the precision she'd brought to 40 years of bookkeeping. She'd left her personal papers to the museum, correspondence with Henry Whitmore, photographs from the mill's operation, documentation of the textile industry's decline that explained why Henry had fought so desperately to keep operating when economics made closure inevitable. Her funeral had drawn former mill workers who were now in their 80s and 90s, people who remembered Henry as demanding but fair, who'd watched the building's abandonment with sadness and its restoration with cautious approval. They'd told Daniel stories about working conditions and production quotas and the pride that came from making textiles that met standards most competitors ignored. "Henry drove us hard," one former weaver said during the reception Daniel hosted at the mill. "But he also paid fairly, maintained safe equipment, never asked us to cut corners for profit. When the mill closed, we lost more than jobs, we lost the identity that came from doing work that mattered, from being part of something bigger than individual survival." The observation had stayed with Daniel, had shaped his understanding of what the mill's transformation meant. He wasn't just providing affordable workspace, he was creating the same kind of meaningful work identity that textile production had once provided, was proving that buildings could anchor community through serving purposes that mattered beyond simple economic transaction. The Textile Museum had grown into something beyond Daniel's initial vision. Working looms demonstrated production methods from the mill's operation. Exhibits showed how the industry had evolved and eventually moved offshore, explained the economic forces that had killed American textile manufacturing regardless of individual owners' dedication or workers' skills. School groups visited regularly, learning about industrial history and economic change and the human cost of industries that built communities before abandoning them. But the museum also told the mill's second story, how abandoned buildings could be restored for new purposes, how found wealth could be used to serve community rather than individual enrichment, how inheritance came with obligations to honor what previous generations had built while adapting to serve present needs. Henry Whitmore's preserved office remained the emotional center, his letter to whoever found his hidden fortune displayed alongside photographs showing both his textile operation and the mill's current use. Thomas Whitmore had died 5 years earlier at 82, his final years marked by what his family described as reconciliation with his father's memory. He'd visited the mill regularly, had contributed funding for the Textile Museum, had written his own letter that was now displayed beside Henry's. My father died believing his children had failed him, that we didn't value what he'd built or understand the sacrifice textile production required. He was right that we wanted him to sell and retire, to admit that holding on to a dying industry served ego more than economics. But we were also right that his stubborn dedication to the mill had consumed relationships that should have mattered more than property. Daniel Foster found the fortune my father hid and used it better than we would have, not by maximizing profit but by creating community in a building that had isolated its final owner. That's the lesson I spent my life learning too slowly. Inheritance matters through what you build with it rather than what you simply preserve or liquidate. My father's dedication to quality and fair treatment of workers was worth preserving. His isolation and bitterness weren't. Daniel managed to honor the first while learning from the second. The letter represented forgiveness that had taken decades to achieve, represented understanding that complicated men could be both right and wrong about what mattered. Thomas had spent his final years documenting the Whitmore family's textile history, had donated photographs and business records that added depth to the museum's exhibits, had made peace with his father through accepting that Henry's mistakes didn't erase his achievements. Emma Whitmore, Thomas's granddaughter, had become the museum's volunteer curator after finishing her degree in industrial history. She was 30 now, had spent her 20s researching New England's textile industry and the families who'd built it. Her work added academic rigor to exhibits that might otherwise have been purely sentimental, showed how individual stories like Henry's fit into broader economic patterns that had transformed the region. My great-great-grandfather wasn't unique, Emma explained during a presentation to visiting students. Hundreds of mill owners faced the same pressures, industry moving offshore, operating costs exceeding revenues, children who wanted to preserve capital rather than lose it slowly through maintaining unprofitable operations. Most of them closed or sold. Henry fought longer than most, which was both admirable stubbornness and tragic inability to accept change. Carter had absorbed these lessons through growing up in the mill, through watching his father build community while learning from Henry's isolation. His furniture company operated from ground floor workshop space he rented at the same below-market rates other tenants paid, proving he understood that family privilege meant opportunity but not exemption from the principles Daniel had established. His designs had won awards for sustainability and craftsmanship, had attracted attention from galleries and retailers who wanted to stock work that combined traditional joinery with modern aesthetics. But he'd chosen to grow slowly, to maintain quality over quantity, to build a business that could sustain itself without requiring the kind of scaling that would force compromise on the standards he'd learned mattered. I could move to a larger facility, hire employees, increase production, Carter told Daniel one evening while they worked together finishing a commission. But then I'd become manager rather than maker, and the work would lose what makes it meaningful. You taught me that lesson through the mill. Some things matter more than maximum profit. The observation pleased Daniel more than he could easily express, showed that Carter had learned not just skills but values, had absorbed lessons about measuring worth through what you built and how you treated people rather than simply what you accumulated. He'd grown up watching his father fight to keep found fortune, had seen that fight's purpose wasn't keeping money but proving worthy of the trust Henry Whitmore had placed in whoever was desperate enough to value what his family had abandoned. The mill's financial sustainability had proven Daniel's model wasn't just idealistic but practical. Operating costs were covered through below-market rents that nonetheless reflected the value tenants received: affordable workspace, shared equipment, collaborative community, location along the river that made the building attractive despite its industrial past. The modest surplus funded maintenance and improvements, allowed gradual restoration of sections that had been too damaged for immediate use. But more importantly, the model had been replicated. Other abandoned mills in New England had been purchased by people who'd visited Daniel's operation and seen proof that restoration for community use could work. Not all succeeded. Some locations lacked the density to support maker spaces, some owners lacked Daniel's combination of resources and commitment. But enough work that a network had developed. Former industrial buildings transformed into affordable workspace for artists and craftspeople who were being displaced by rising rents in gentrifying areas. Daniel had become unlikely advocate for this approach, had spoken at planning meetings and economic development conferences about using abandoned industrial properties to serve community needs rather than just maximizing development value. He wasn't comfortable with public speaking, had learned through necessity rather than natural inclination, but he believed in the model enough to push past discomfort. "We treat affordable housing like a problem to be managed through regulations and subsidies," he'd told a conference of urban planners. "But we have thousands of abandoned industrial buildings that could be restored to provide affordable workspace and living space if we stopped measuring success purely through property tax revenue and development fees. Henry Whitmore's fortune gave me resources to prove this model works. But it shouldn't require found wealth, it should be standard practice when communities have people who need space and buildings that need purpose." On a warm evening in late August, 20 years after buying the mill for $290, Daniel stood on the third-floor balcony watching the annual gathering that had become tradition. The Mill Heritage Celebration, a day when the building opened to the community, when tenants displayed their work, when former textile workers shared stories about the building's original purpose, when people who'd been helped by affordable workspace gave back through teaching and mentoring. Rebecca joined him with 2 glasses of the cider she still made from trees behind the building, both of them comfortable in the silence that had developed through 15 years of partnership. They'd built something together that honored both connection and independence, had proven that relationships could be constructed thoughtfully rather than falling into conventional patterns just because tradition said that's how things were done. "Carter's talking about buying the old shoe factory in Dover," Rebecca said, settling against the railing. "Wants to convert it using the same model you established here, maker space and affordable studios, community resource rather than just profitable development." Daniel felt pride mixed with concern, pride that his son wanted to replicate what the mill had proven possible, concern that Carter was taking on enormous responsibility at 25. But he'd been 34 and desperate when he'd bought this building, had learned through trial and error rather than careful planning. Carter had advantages Daniel hadn't: resources, experience watching the mill's development, network of people who'd help because they believed in the model. "What did you tell him?" "That he should talk to you about what the first years were actually like. The legal battles, the environmental remediation, the constant pressure from people who wanted him to fail or sell. He sees the success but maybe not the cost of building it." They stood together watching celebration happening below, workshops demonstrating traditional crafts, food trucks run by tenants who'd started catering businesses, children learning weaving on the restored industrial looms. The building was alive with the kind of activity Henry Whitmore had built it for, though the specific work was different from textile production. The purpose was the same: people making things that mattered, contributing skills that created value beyond simple economic transaction. As evening settled over the river and lights came on throughout the mill, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here. The eviction notice that had started everything. The desperate auction bid on property he hadn't seen in person. The discovery of documents that should have been impossible but weren't. The battles fought and won not through superior resources but through stubborn refusal to surrender what had been legitimately found. He thought about Henry Whitmore dying alone in the office below them, hiding wealth as final act of defiance against family he believed had failed to value what he'd built. About Thomas Whitmore spending his final years making peace with his father's memory, accepting that both men had been right and wrong about what mattered. About Margaret Chin dedicating her final months to documenting history so people would remember not just success but struggle, not just achievement but cost. The mill had taken much: Henry's life in final peace, years of Daniel's life spent fighting to keep what he'd found, the isolation that came from choosing property preservation over easier paths. But the mill had also given more than it took: security for Carter, community for people who needed affordable workspace, proof that abandoned buildings could be restored to serve purposes beyond maximum profit. 20 years had transformed desperate purchase into thriving community resource, had changed a man running from homelessness into someone who'd built something meaningful from accident and courage. The fortune Henry had provided resources, but Daniel's choices about using those resources had determined whether they served purposes beyond simple enrichment. Carter appeared on the balcony, bringing Emma Whitmore with him. They'd become friends through the museum, had collaborated on exhibits and historical research, had found connection despite their family's complicated history. She carried documents she'd discovered in her grandfather's papers, photographs of the mill during its operation, business records showing Henry's commitment to fair wages and safe conditions, letters between Thomas and Henry that revealed decades of conflict that neither man could bridge. "I thought these should be in the museum," Emma said, handing the folder to Daniel. "They show both men trying to communicate across differences neither could fully understand. My grandfather wanted his father to acknowledge that economics mattered. Henry wanted Thomas to acknowledge that principles mattered more. They were both right." Daniel looked through photographs showing the mill in its industrial prime, workers at looms, finished textiles stacked for shipping, Henry Whitmore standing in the same ground floor space that now housed woodworking equipment and welding stations. The building was fundamentally different but also somehow the same, had traded textile production for diverse craft but had retained its purpose as place where skilled work created meaning beyond simple survival. As darkness completed its claim on the day and the celebration below began to disperse, Daniel felt the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, the mill would house craftspeople, the museum would teach history, Carter would build his own version of what Daniel had proven possible. But closure on the journey that had started with eviction notice and desperate gamble, that had led through discovery and battle and slow transformation of both people and place. The river flowed past foundation walls that had supported the building for over a century, patient and persistent, witnessing the slow work of mills being built and abandoned and restored for new purposes. Henry Whitmore had poured his life into textile production, had died protecting wealth he couldn't enjoy because protection mattered more than use. Daniel had found that wealth and had poured it back into the building, had created something that honored Henry's dedication while learning from his isolation. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs, witnessing the patient work of buildings finding new purposes and people proving that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. Henry had hidden his fortune believing his family didn't deserve it, had died alone because he'd chosen property over people. Daniel had found that fortune and had used it to prove that buildings could serve community rather than isolate owners, that legacy was built through what you created and shared rather than what you simply protected and hoarded. The mill would stand long after Daniel was gone, would continue housing artists and craftspeople and people learning trades that connected them to tradition while serving present needs. It would stand as monument to the idea that inheritance came with obligations, that found wealth mattered most through what you built with it, that the measure of life well lived wasn't accumulation but what you created that served purposes larger than yourself. Carter and Emma remained on the balcony talking about the shoe factory project, about replicating the mill's model in a different building with different needs, about learning from 20 years of Daniel's experience while adapting to serve Dover's community. Rebecca was already offering advice about structural assessment and environmental remediation, about the unglamorous work that preceded restoration, about patience required to build things that would outlast their builders. Daniel listened to them planning, feeling the satisfying weight of having built something worth replicating, having proven through 20 years of sustained effort that the model worked not just in theory but in practice. He'd stumbled into the mill through desperation, had found fortune through accident, had fought to keep both through stubborn refusal to surrender to pressure. But what he'd built from that combination, community in a building designed for industrial isolation, affordable workspace in a region where rents displaced craftspeople, proof that abandoned buildings could serve purposes beyond maximum development value, that was achievement that transcended luck or accident into the realm of intention and sustained commitment. The building breathed in the night air, its walls holding stories that spanned more than a century, its purpose transformed but its essential character preserved. Henry Whitmore had built it for textiles, had operated it for decades, had hidden his final fortune within it as challenge to whoever proved worthy of finding it. Daniel had found that fortune and had transformed challenge into community, had used wealth to build rather than simply possess, had taught Carter and influenced others that legacy was something you created through choices rather than something you simply inherited through blood or accident. The mill stood as monument to that understanding, to the idea that buildings were tools for serving purposes beyond their owner's enrichment, that found wealth mattered through what you built and shared rather than what you simply kept. The river had witnessed it all, construction and operation and abandonment and restoration, and would continue witnessing long after everyone currently alive was gone, patient and persistent in its flow past stone foundations that had outlasted the men who'd built them and would outlast the men who'd restored them. That continuity was comfort rather than threat, was proof that what you built with care and intention could outlast you, could serve purposes you couldn't fully anticipate, could honor both tradition and adaptation in ways that made inheritance meaningful rather than burdensome. Daniel had inherited nothing from his own parents except early death and grief, had built everything he and Carter had through work and luck and stubborn refusal to surrender when surrender would have been easier. But he'd also inherited Henry Whitmore's trust that whoever found his hidden fortune would use it wisely, would value the building enough to defend it, would build community where Henry had built isolation. That inheritance, of trust and challenge and example of what not to do, had shaped 20 years of choices that transformed desperate purchase into thriving community resource. The celebration was ending below, people heading home through darkness that felt comfortable in its familiarity, comfortable in the knowledge that the mill would be there tomorrow and next year and decades hence, serving purposes that might evolve but that would remain true to the principles Daniel had established: accessibility, quality, community, the understanding that buildings served people rather than people serving buildings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.